Hey everyone, welcome back to CK Cycles. In a previous video, I completed a compression check on my 74 DT250 and it came out to be about 60 psi. That told me that there's probably something going on inside the engine that needs to be addressed so that I can get the compression up and get the bike to run. After disassembling the top end of the engine and completing an inspection of the cylinder, the piston, and the piston rings, I think I found out what happened to this engine, and I'd like to show you. One of the first things I took a look at after disassembling the top end of the engine was the piston itself. I noticed on top of the piston it is stamped 50, which indicates to me that this is a 0.5 millimeter oversized piston, which tells me that at one time this cylinder has already been off of the engine, probably has been bored out, and this oversized piston and oversized rings installed. The next thing I looked at here is the pin that is in the ring groove on the piston. There's a pin here for the lower ring and a pin here for the upper ring. And so I believe that the pins are there so that when the piston and the rings are installed, the ring end gap indexes here on this pin, and thus it doesn't allow the ring to slide back and forth and rotate within the ring groove. I think that on a two-stroke engine, it's important to keep the end gap of the ring in a very specific spot, since there are port windows within the cylinder that I don't believe you want the end gap of the piston rings running in those port windows, and thus catching and could damage the piston and the rings and so on. I noticed here that the pin for the top ring appears to be damaged, and there is also damage to the piston itself. After I saw this damage, I took a look at the top ring. On this end of the top ring, I see that it looks like there's still a factory edge which indexes against that pin. But over here on this side of the piston ring, on this side of the gap, it looks like that is not a factory edge, and it looks like that probably was broken. So I'm thinking at one point, the end of the ring where it indexes onto the pin broke. And that was probably causing my low compression. Now, why that broke, I'm not exactly sure. I took a look inside the cylinder to see if I could tell. It's going to be hard to see until I get a better light and some photographs here inside the cylinder itself. But inside the cylinder, if I set the piston in here, how it is oriented with the ring end gap of the top ring that was damaged in its proper spot, I noticed that it ends up to be right about here on the cylinder. So if I keep my mark there and I pull it out and I look down inside, I can see that there is damage to the cylinder wall itself. So what I believe happened to this bike is that the end of the ring broke and began to score the cylinder wall, and also damaged the piston, and thus I had very low compression in this cylinder. When I run my finger over that damaged area, I can definitely feel that there is a little bit of a trench there. It's not enough to really catch a fingernail, but I can definitely feel it. So that tells me that if I want to reuse this cylinder, I'm going to have to get it bored out over yet again and get an even larger sized piston and larger rings and get them reinstalled. But my question is, how big do I need to go? And that's what I'm going to determine next. In order to determine that, I'm going to use my bore gauge here. I have my bore gauge set so that it zeroes out at 70.5 millimeters, which should be the bore of this cylinder if it was brand new and ready for a 0.5 millimeter oversized piston. What I'm going to do is put this leg of my bore gauge into the deepest part of the groove that was ground in and try and get an idea of how deep that is. So that'll tell me how big I need to go when it comes to ordering my oversized piston. I'm going to do it for myself first, and then afterwards I will show you what that is. Okay, let me see if I can show you. Okay, so I have my bore gauge set to 70.5 millimeter, which if this cylinder bore was in perfect condition after being bored out to accept a 0.5 millimeter oversized piston, it should be pretty much 70.5 millimeter, which means my zero mark right there. So anything beyond 0 is beyond the 70.5 millimeter. I have the 1 foot of my bore gauge down in the deepest part of the trench where the damage occurred from the broken piston ring, and I am running about 5 thousandths over 70.5 millimeter. If I move just to another spot in the bore itself, I am generally running about 3 thousandths over 70.5 millimeter. So now I'm going to have to go and do a little conversion to see exactly what those measurements are in millimeters, and that will maybe tell me about how big I need to go on my oversized piston and rings. Okay, so I think I know what I'm going to have to do here to get the bike back up and running again. I believe that the standard bore on a DT250 is 70 millimeters with an acceptable tolerance of 70.2 millimeters. I have to add a 0.5 millimeter onto that because this bore has already been bored out a 0.5 millimeter oversized. So really, if this cylinder was in great condition, I should be able to measure it at 70.5 to 70.52 millimeters, but that is not what I'm getting. When I take a general measurement of the cylinder outside of the trench that was left by the damaged ring, I am reading 70.57 millimeters, which is outside the specification. Down in the trench, I am running 70.62 millimeters. So you can see how deep that trench is. What I think I'm going to be able to do is go with a 70.75 piston and ring kit. I believe that in doing so, it should be able to clean up any of that trench that is left by the damaged ring and hopefully take care of any oblongness and handle what needs to be done with the taper and things like that, and still get this cylinder back to where it needs to be and to get this bike running again. Alrighty, so I am not an expert in this. I'm just taking some rudimentary measurements. The measuring tools I am using are not the most expensive things out there, but I think that they are just good enough to give me an idea of what's going on here with the cylinder, and enough to tell me I need to go and get a professional's help in getting this cleaned up and getting new piston and new rings installed. So this is Chris for CK Cycles. We'll see you later.